what do you do if no one shows up for class? Do you still record yourself speaking?
I haven't had that occasion
Oh, that's good.
yet, but
Good.
I've been thinking about it because even though might not have enough people here, even one, there's theoretically 7 people that would be watching this,
Yeah.
so I should still do it. Remember, too, I have the same class on Friday evenings, and there's 31 people in that class. So that class meets and has plenty of interaction and so on. And I try to do the same thing there, so there's a duplicate set. Although the camera will only record for 2 hours, and then it craps out. So if I record the first half here, and then the second half there, that should cover the whole 2 periods, perhaps. Plus there's tons of other copies of my trying to do the same thing on the web. So we got up to the sophists. The sophists were wisdom teachers, and there's all sorts of argument over what kind of wisdom they were actually teaching. Protagoras is primarily one of the most famous, and Protagoras' basic teaching was man is the measure of all things. Well, what does that mean? Well, it basically means that there is no absolute right or wrong, truth or whatever. Instead, it's all dependent on what the community basically agrees to, right? So in a sense, it's very pragmatic. The idea that, well, if we think this, then that's the truth. If we think this, then that's the truth, right? Well, one of the students of the sophists, or at least one who learned from the sophists, whether he was a poor young boy anyway, so I don't know that he actually paid any of them to learn something, but he was, that was Socrates, right? And Socrates disagreed, basically, and so he would argue with them. And he must have established quite an interesting reputation, because at some point one of his friends named Chaerephon, which sounds like, well, this is what Chaerephon did, because it basically means he's the one that heard the message, right? Phon means sound, right? So he went to the Temple of Delphi. Did I show you a picture of Delphi? It's there, right? You could still go there as a tourist. So he went to Delphi and paid to ask the priestess the question, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And the priestess basically said, no. You know, I just picture her sitting there pretty much drunk from the, asphyxiated from the fumes, over the volcanic crack that the temple was basically built on, right? I mean, that was their job. They sat on a tripod seat, right, over the crack, inhaling these fumes. So basically, they were nearly senseless. In fact, there are like arguments between the priestesses some days that the fumes were too strong for them to do the job. So they would argue that they needed that day off. And the priests, of course, hated that because that meant no money would come in because people had to pay to ask the question, right, of this oracle, right, of Apollo, right. Well, Chaerephon tells Socrates that the priestess, the god, has said that you are the wisest. And Socrates, of course, what? Did you read the Apology? Anybody have the chance?
You kind of went over it last class.
So he basically, argues that, there's no way I'm the wisest. So he went out to find someone who was wiser, and he figured that would answer that. Well, but the end result was he ended up finding out that no one really was wiser. It doesn't mean that he's wiser. His conclusion, I think, in the Apology in the trial is that no one's wise. The gods only are wise, and we aren't. But clearly this irritated the heck out of people. And so they put him on trial for corrupting the youth, right? Do you think he corrupted them? From what you've read of Socrates? Annoyed the heck out of everybody, right? No? Yes? I always picture him as being a hit with the young people. Because I picture young people as being thrilled to irritate adults. Right? Is that, I'm thinking young kids, teenagers would probably be pretty similar then as they are today, I would guess. There are other explanations for why he's on trial. In a book called The Trial of Socrates by I.P. Stone, who was a retired reporter who basically decided in his retirement he was going to learn Greek and read all the ancient philosophers in the original and start from the beginning. And he got as far as reading about the Apology, and then he died. So that was pretty dumb. I.P. Stone, I.F. Stone, let me double check. Maybe it's I.F. Stone. Trial Socrates. So that's it. There's the book. His argument is basically that the reason Socrates was put on trial was because if you look at the way the history works out, Athens and Sparta are at war with one another. And Athens defended itself by building a wall, which is kind of interesting because Pericles was the leader at the time. He's the one that thought the wall would be their best defense. And para means around, and cles, the glory of what's around. So his name literally means the glory of the wall. That's, just weird, right? How that works. I think I mentioned, Aristophanes, who was one of the playwrights, wrote a lot of comedies, won the award for best play for 2 years in a row. Aristophanes means best play. Aristo means best, and phanes is a display, an appearance, a show. It's just weird, right? So basically, I think of all these names as being more like titles for what the individual did so much. By the way, like Moses, to lead out, basically, he led the Hebrews out of Egypt. Or a lot of people point out, well, he was also drawn out of the river, right? Remember his mom put him in a reed basket, and floated him down the river, etc. Right? So it's not just the Greek names are like titles, I think. I've never found a good place to explain all of that, though, and I've looked, so it's very annoying. Maybe one of you could, get a PhD and, and do all that. That would be great. Okay, so Socrates is, of course, in the city when they're surrounded by the Spartans. And, of course, eventually they end up getting sick. They have a plague in the city, and they lose. So the Spartans win. Pericles died too, by the way. But the Spartans take over, and they put in charge a group of tyrants that are going to run the city. And one of the first things that the tyrants do is they try to prune out all the people that were the enemies of the Spartans, the Democrats, basically. And so they sent hitmen out to kill them. And Socrates wasn't one of the ones they wanted to kill, but he knew a lot of the individuals that they wanted to kill, and so they basically ordered Socrates to accompany a group of hitmen to find one or more of the ones they wanted to kill, and Socrates refused to do it. And so a lot of people thought that that must have meant that Socrates was somehow one of, or an associate of the tyrants that were killing all these people, because they didn't kill him. But eventually the Democrats got power back over the tyrants, and they killed the tyrants. And that's when they charged Socrates with his crimes, right? So it makes it look, as I.F. Stone argues, that the real reason that they were putting him on trial was because they thought he was associated with the ones that Sparta put in charge, right? So that's kind of interesting. By the way, Plato might have been associated with that group too, because he was a wealthy young man at the time. But notice that in the Apology, he's listed as one of the 300 in the jury, basically. So not sure really where that goes, right? So it's kind of interesting. There are alternative reasons why Socrates might have been on trial. But the main reason is that he's not pious. And for that, it's kind of interesting. If we go to one of the other... So we can go to the Apology, and then we can go into the... Remember, this is a big website, so you can look at all of the texts, not just of Plato, by the way, but notice you can look at all of these authors. I believe all of their works are on here, right? But only in English translation. So if you wanted to look at them in their original Greek or Latin, what you have to do is go to the Perseus project. Perseus was the one who sailed the Argo for the Golden Fleece, if you remember. But so the Perseus project has all of these texts in not only English translation, but also in their original, so you could find them in Greek and so on. But if we go and look for the Euthyphro, which was one of the ones I mentioned, although I didn't require it to be read. It's a kind of read all you like buffet. It's not my fault, but the internet has everything. So basically, if you're interested in really learning a lot, there's plenty of opportunity out there. You don't have to buy an $80 book with a couple of the articles in it. You can actually just go. That's why I didn't request a book, right? You could just go on the internet and read them all. But so the Euthyphro, which, by the way, a couple other things I should mention. The works of Plato are where you find all these dialogues with Socrates in it. Socrates isn't the author. Plato's the author, and Plato hardly ever is part of the dialogues. So you don't read Plato to actually see what Plato's saying officially. What you see is Socrates as the main character, right? But scholars argue that there's three main periods. We can break it down into three main periods. The earliest period of Plato's dialogues are dialogues that treat Socrates the way he really was. He's basically an asshole that got everybody mad at him because he asked questions that nobody can answer, even pretty much today, right? Annoys the heck out of everybody. Then you move into the second period, quite a bit larger, right? where Socrates all of a sudden acts very differently in the dialogues, because instead of asking questions that annoy everybody, he's instead answering the questions and telling everybody all the answers, which is well, plus it's boring. In the early dialogues, you could see a real give and take between people, because they're coming up with answers and he's destroying them. So it's really interesting debate kind of material, right? But when you get to the middle period, now all of a sudden, so what else, Socrates? And then he explains a long thing. He says, wow, that's beautiful, Socrates. What else, Socrates? And he explains, so it's way more boring, basically. But that's also the period where we end up getting what's called idealism. Plato's philosophy is where we get idealism, the first beginnings of that. And we'll talk about what idealism is in that sense. Right? And then there's the third period, and the third period seems to be, my favorite way of viewing it is that now he's been working with Aristotle for roughly 20 years or so, and Aristotle's come up with a lot of questions that has shown Plato flaws in his philosophy of idealism. And so the third period now are questions about idealism that you really can't answer again, right? So it's kind of an interesting set of period. Plato lived roughly to 80-something, so quite a long life. Right? But so another interesting thing about the dialogues, if you go and look up Stephanus and others, for Stephanus pagination, okay? This is the system. I suppose you're familiar with This is the system that lists every book and every page and every paragraph of Plato's works. Stephanus was the scholar that organized them into 3 volumes, and as long as you know, say, Symposium 198a, right? You can go right to the paragraph that you're talking about, for example. And that's regardless of which translation. Pretty much everyone uses it. Right? The other thing that's interesting is they're clearly written in codes, although it's difficult because we don't have the original Greek, probably. We do have original Greek versions of them, but we're not sure if that's even how they were arranged. And how they were arranged, theoretically, is in 12s. Plato was probably a follower of Pythagoras, and if you remember, Pythagoras had lots of interesting theories. The arche for Pythagoras was number. A lot of things he thought of, like the table of opposites, we still, in a sense, have as a cultural oddity in our current day. We also have the divided string idea, where you've got harmonies that eventually became, way later with Bach, the way that we create music with harmonies, which, by the way, isn't universal. So just because that's the way we do it, notice that India raga music is based on 12 tones between our notes. So, and by the way, it's kind of interesting. I know this is a little bit of an aside, but it seems like the Greeks were the ones with Pythagoras' theory that had that impact on Western music. And in fact, it didn't spread everywhere because if you go to the farthest extremes of the European landmass, for example, where the Celts were, they still have the musical tones that the ragas from India have. So if you listen to Celtic music, it's very similar in a lot of ways to the way the ragas are with their 12 tones and so on. You could play examples of it for that would be a music class kind of thing. And there's songs in Portugal, for example, that use the same thing. And it's really quite different. There's a very emotional feeling to that kind of music that is missing from the Western music. But there is an advantage, and that is eventually with the Western music, with the way the music is separated by those octaves, basically, you end up with an ability to have harmonies with different musical instruments. If you compare, for example, a full orchestra, take the London Philharmonic playing, a full symphony, right? With all the different parts, they can all sound really good together. I don't believe there's any other kind of musical culture that could put that much musical instruments together and sound good all playing together, unless it's a Western influenced organization. So, because if they're playing all these extra tones, the 12 tones in between the notes, there's no room for that kind of, alto, soprano, basso, tenor, right? You can't mix voices like that. So Pythagoras may have had quite the impact on the way I think that Britney Spears, the way she sings, thanks to Pythagoras. So Plato was probably a Pythagorean, and it seems like all of his codes are in 12s. So if you analyze the lines, everything comes in 12s. You'd have to look it up to see how that actually plays out in lots of different things. So like the entire dialogue might be 144 lines, for example. And by the way, right in the very exact middle of the dialogue, each dialogue, is the topic of the dialogue in exactly the middle. It's kind of interesting. And by the way, the topic of the dialogue is the title of the dialogue. So, for example, if we look at the euthyphro, EU is the prefix for good. We see that in English in euthanasia, good death, right? We see it in eucalyptus, which I guess is a good kind of tree. I don't know what a eucalyptus does, right? But so eutheo is God, right? Same really as Zeus, Theus, Theo, Deo in Latin, for example. So we've got so good, God, and phro is phronesis or analysis. So basically, euthyphro means good God analysis. And euthyphro, the character in the dialogue, is a priest who knows all the answers about the gods, right? So that's him, right? Good God analysis. If you want to know anything about the gods, go to euthyphro, right? Well, it turns out that Socrates is waiting for his trial and is in line behind Euthyphro, who's next to go up for his trial. And they get talking about what he's there for. He's going to put his father on charges for killing his slave, etc., etc., etc. But in any case, Euthyphro is a priest and knows everything about how to be pious. And so Socrates says, since I'm going on trial for not being pious, before I go in there, could you give me lessons on how to be pious? That way, I could at least say to them, I'm sorry I'm an old screwball, but at least I'm taking lessons on how to be pious, so I'm not such a bad person anymore, from Euthyphro. And Euthyphro is, of course, I'll give you lessons. So Socrates asks Euthyphro, what is piety? And Euthyphro answers, doing what the gods love, right, is what it means to be pious. Well, Socrates in his typical way, and so this is a typical early dialogue where he asks questions that drive people crazy, right? And so he points out that there's different gods, for example, Zeus, who loves to fool around and do bad things. And then there's his wife, Hera, who's in charge of matrimony and order, right? And time, right? And so if I'm doing what Zeus loves, then Hera's going to be mad at me. And if I'm doing what Hera loves, then Zeus is going to think I'm, a wimp or whatever, right? So how do I answer that? And Euthyphro gets confused. He's not sure how to answer that, because basically you're in a situation where you've got two specific poems or phrases in poems that he's basically repeated, right? And he's in trouble now because Socrates is asking him to do something that he obviously doesn't do, and that is try to get some kind of all-around explanation of what it means to be pious that doesn't get into conflict with other examples, right? And this is really something I want to bring up here because we've got a couple interesting things going on in sequence. One is the Greek alphabet. Seems to have really opened up an opportunity for the people who used Greek that other languages in the ancient world did not have yet. And that is their alphabet is different than the pictographs or the hieroglyphics that the other languages use, because the pictographs depict a specific object. Hieroglyph might be used as a sound because it depicts like an owl. So whatever the word for owl was, that becomes kind of the sound of the owl, right? Or the letter in the word owl, right? But there's still pictures of objects. Once you start with the phonetic alphabet of the Greek language, and I'm not sure if the Phoenician alphabet was also phonetic or not, but you can look them up and so on. But if you look at the Greek alphabet, they are not pictures, the letters are not pictures of things, they're pictures of your mouth making the sound, right? Yes? Are you familiar with that? So O is a real easy one, right? O. You've got theta, for example, right? If you look at some of them, it's pretty difficult to imagine. But, so, for example, if you try to say ah, and see how your tongue kind of goes across the roof of your mouth, you get a basically. Beta, you think of it as sideways. You're going like this, right? But the easy ones are like theta, iota. You imagine that these are actually drawings of the mouth of someone making the sounds, etc. By the way, Omicron is small o. Omega is big O, right? So you've got some. But if you can imagine, what the alphabet enables is for you to write words that express the sound of the words, because you're getting the sound of the letters. So instead of a picture of like a rat or a pig or a house or a person, right, you've actually got a sound. So now you can end up with words being recorded that are sounds that actually don't have to depict a specific object. In other words, it's a higher level of abstraction, so that your writing now can be about things that actually don't exist in a physical sense, right? Now, when we get to Plato, something else happens that makes use of this, and Eric Havelock, the muse, learns to write. Eric Havelock, by the way, was the father of one of my friends. Was a professor, first in Toronto, in Canada, but then at Harvard. He famously argues that the muse, which is poetry, right, in Greek, learns to write, and it becomes prose. So instead of writing in poetry, which was also very specific. So in the poems, you basically have poems talking about an individual doing something that's brave, like Achilles, for example, right? Even though, by the way, Achilles is the guy that's insulted, right? So, no, Cles is honor, right? So Achilles, has no honor. The reason he has no honor in the Iliad is because Agamemnon, gametes, no gametes, in other words, dickless. Right? Sorry, but Agamemnon is an absolutely ridiculed character in the Iliad, even though he's the king. He can't even count, he doesn't know how many men he has, and what does he do? He's upset because his prize has been taken away from him, because the priest comes and says, you can't have that priestess, because the gods are upset, and he doesn't want the gods upset, so he gives her back. And then he's upset because he doesn't have a prize, and Menelaus, his brother, says to him, well, you're the king, you can take whatever prize you want. So he goes and he takes Achilles' prize, which is absolutely stupid, because Achilles, if you know the plot, is like the whole army practically. Everybody else just runs around and yee-haw, and Achilles is the one that kind of butchers the whole field, right? So by getting Achilles upset, Achilles sits down by the sharp ships. So I'm not fighting anymore because I'm insulted. He's Achilles now, right? He's been insulted by Dictys, right? So is that bad? Should I not say things like that? It's just my translation of his name. Right? No gametes. Okay. Well, so if you look at like the Iliad and the Odyssey, you end up with very specific things that are passed on as the teachings to the young men through learning and repeating these poems. But what you're learning is very specific behaviors in very specific places. So in other words, in order to be pious, Achilles does this, and so does this, and so does this. But nowhere does it explain what, in an abstract sense, piety means. Plato is inventing abstract ideas. That's the idea, right? This is where they first appear, at least in Greece, right? It's not something people apparently have done before. So it's a major leap for mankind to suddenly start thinking in abstract universal terms. Of course, the problem now is, what the heck are these things? Because they're universal, not particular, right? In the Euthyphro, you guys having fun? Is this interesting? Am I boring you to death? No. Okay. So in the Euthyphro, Socrates explains to poor Euthyphro, who can't quite grasp what Socrates is after, and that is the pious because the gods love it? Or do the gods love the pious because it's so pious? See the problem? Right? Do the gods love the pious because it's so pious? Means that we would be able to figure out what piety is, apart from all of the gods attempting to like it, right? In other words, we could use our reason to think the abstract concept and understand what it means. And that's what the gods love. On the other hand, is it because the gods love it that we call it pious? In which case, one god can love something, and oh, that's pious. Another god can love something else, and that's pious.
Can you state that original question again?
Okay. Do the gods love the pious because it's pious? I think that was the second half of the first time I iterated. Or is the pious pious because the gods love it? Actually, you can probably find the actual. See, this is the kind of thing that would drive a person crazy. Because if the reason, have a good evening, be safe out there, are you sure I'm not driving you crazy, or you do have to go somewhere else?
I have to bring my husband dinner. He's stuck at work.
Well, that's a mighty worthy, that's very pious, actually, I'm sure. Is the pious pious because husbands love it? Or do husbands love the pious because it's so pious? It's kind of fun. So,
Can it be both?
well, theoretically, I don't see why not. But you would have to have a real consensus among the gods, and that clearly isn't what the Greeks have when you look at their literature. Because there's a very anthropomorphic nature to the gods, and they each have their own characteristics. You know, they all like different things. Apollo is a god of reason, but a whole bunch of other things. I mean, Apollo could even be in conflict with himself, I would think, because of all the various things he's associated with. On the other hand, Dionysius, you know, or if you think, you know, what does he do? He celebrates craziness, right? Getting drunk, you know, at the festival, right? Being drunk and having an orgy and all that sort of stuff. Totally the opposite of what Apollo would like. So you really have a problem with a pantheon of gods that are all different kinds of people. And that's an issue for Euthyphro. He's never dealt with that apparently before. Never occurred to them that this is a conflict. By the way, pointing this kind of thing out and getting the youth to like this answer basically ends up being impious, because now they're going to make fun of this kind of conflict. So you could see how Socrates would clearly get in trouble with the priesthood. And in fact, Euthyphro is furious because he can't answer this question. So he leaves. And that's the end of the dialogue, right? Because he gives up. But so, by the way, this is considered to be like the killer question for people who say things like, God told me such and such, so that's what you should go do. Because, lots of other folks out there say, God told me this and so, and that's not what God told so-and-so. We've got all these different conflicting priests telling us what God says, right? And so basically, this question says, well, we can't listen to you saying this is what God says. We have to figure out for ourselves what God would want, what really is pious. I have to have a consensus, a rational consensus. And in fact, for Plato, reason is going to actually give us the answer by itself. He is inventing ideas, and he goes on to invent the idea that ideas exist and that the real structure of the universe is based on the structure of the ideas. Well, in the Apology, Socrates, of course, is in trouble, because by asking these kinds of questions, he's screwing around with society. He's screwing around with the cultural behaviors of the youth, getting them to mock the so-called wise leaders in the community who don't have answers to these kinds of questions, right? So yes, Socrates is found guilty, locked up in jail. In fact, you could go visit the jail, it's still there. Still have his jail if you want to go visit it. And then we go into some other dialogues. The first one, while he's in jail, is the Crito. Crito, by the way, is the same root for critical thinking. So if we go back to the Crito. Crito comes to Socrates in the jail, and he's organized an escape for Socrates. That's not just Crito, it's a whole bunch of friends. Have all paid the guards, they've bribed everybody that they need to, and it's all ready. Socrates can leave. And leave Athens and go to, I think, Thebes, in order, where everyone's all waiting for him to come so we could party like we usually do and have discussions. Everybody's looking forward to it. And Socrates surprises the heck out of Crito by saying, but I'm not leaving. It would be wrong for me to leave. Because my mother, Athens, has basically decided that I should be condemned. And it would be wrong of me, even though I disagree, to not abide by my mother, Athens' punishment. So he refuses to go. And he even explains, if I went to Thebes and I had arguments with everyone, and I tried to argue as I usually do, people would point out to me that, well, you yourself don't live up to your own arguments, because when you were supposed to stay there and be killed, you fled. So you yourself don't obey your own arguments. All kinds of interesting stuff. On the other hand, there's this possibility.